Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Zing, for the very generous introduction. I don't know if I would introduce myself like that, but yeah, this was good. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And good afternoon to you all, and thank you very much for making the time to come listen to a portion of my research that I've been thinking about and working on over the past years, and still thinking about and working on even now. And I would like to express my gratitude to the African Studies Program and the Center for East Asian Studies for the invitation to be here today, and to my incredible colleague and friend, Jing, for facilitating that. And also again to Aliyah and Harry and all who worked tirelessly to make me getting here possible. And again, I was dreading the cold coming to Wisconsin in March. I get here and I'm like, what are you all talking about? This looks good. Yeah, but so in today's talk, I will discuss cultural and material circulations as specific mediation processes for how China understood Africa, the world, and China's place in it. I'll exemplify this through examining the life and work of Zhu Mingying, a prominent Chinese folk singer in the 1970s and 80s. And I'll focus on the social lives of these mediated trans-regional cultural and material encounters of Africa and China in the 20th century. Thinking through the question of what happens to these media and to these mediated trans-regional cultural objects, tangible and intangible, when they move across space and time, I will demonstrate how ideas circulate and in the process take on different forms and contribute to new narratives and or old narratives in new spaces. I'll first begin by recounting how this chapter, which is part of a larger project that I'll talk about shortly, emerged and came into existence. So in 2018, while I was enrolled in a PhD program in Hong Kong, and just coming out of Beijing at the time, and I was somewhat frustrated with discourses in China around how media depictions of Africa and Africans in social media were, and particularly how these were framed as new and episodic. And I asked my then advisor, who is a native of Chongqing and grew up in China in the 1970s and 80s, what her first memory of Africa and Africans was. And her response was, growing up at home, there was a cassette tape of a Chinese musician who was singing African songs. And this was the cassette tape that she was referring to, and I'll get back to that in a minute or so, right? But then this interaction got me thinking about media and other forms of mediated material and cultural productions, not just as representational, but as sites for the production and circulation of knowledge of Africa and Africans in China. And so this case study that I'm going to talk about today is part of an ongoing book project that I am working on, tentatively titled Beyond Solidarity, World-Making in Africa-China Encounters. And this project takes an interdisciplinary approach to the trans-regional media history of Africa in China to examine continuities and fractures in how China understood Africa and its implications for contemporary Africa-China relations. It traces these continuities and fractures in how ideas of Africa were produced and circulated through different media forms across different time periods, so from the 19th century to contemporary times. And I argue that the production of knowledge about Africa and Africanness in Chinese media was central to the process of Chinese world making and China's imagination of its own place in the world. And what this project does is that it steers clear of narratives of China's rise, which we're probably all very familiar with, which is framed predominantly within the discursive terrain of global trade and geopolitics, and China's state-led narratives of solidarity. And so this book shows that a deeper historical understanding of Chinese imaginaries of Africa is crucial if we are to develop a more nuanced account of present-day formations of trans-regional media cultures and politics in a newly forged Afro-Asian conjuncture. Three key issues emerge from this project that are relevant to different degrees for the conversation that we are going to have today. And the first is that of global China. Global China has been engaged with by scholars, both overtly or implied, as China's engagement with the world beyond its borders, This outward-looking engagement mirrors the tracing of capital, which is predominantly that of Chinese capital flows to different parts of the world. And even as some engagement with global China seeks to seeks to examine Chinese engagement that decenters the economic, the political, and that centers the cultural, that these in many ways still trace and mirrors this flow of capital, that we see a lot more scholarship and conversations around what China is doing elsewhere than how this engagement plays out within its own borders. And so I suggest that global China should be understood to include and center how China engages with the world domestically within its own borders. And one way to do this is by thinking about world making and imaginaries within China. And what this does is that it shifts the focus of China's media engagement with the world from capital and opens spaces for thinking with how China understood itself in relation to the world. So world making is taken here as a way of making sense of the world or worlds through different periods of time and through everyday practices, including mediated material and cultural productions. And scholarship on world making in the global South has focused on transatlantic experiences. And this views world making as a project necessitated by the expansion of colonial empires, hence a post-imperial project. In the case of China, world making has been examined through the prism of nationalism and the paradox of nationalism and cosmopolitanism in modern China. And existing scholarship have also engaged with world making through the notion of tianxia, translated as all under heaven, which is interpreted in a number of ways. First, as cosmological, drawing legitimacy from the mandate of heaven. Second, as cultural and philosophical through Confucianism. And lastly, as geographic, drawing on existing tributary systems in ancient China with Southeast Asian regions. By examining Africa's role in world making, room is created to think beyond China's engagement and exchange with its neighbors and the West, and to explore other interactions that formed understandings of the world and China's place in it. World making, of which representations are a part, allows for engaging with the processes while accounting for the motivations of imaginaries grounded in socio-historical conditions and contexts. And this feeds into the need to examine racialized imaginations of Africa and China. But within Chinese academia, which was one space that I was in for quite a while, the notion of race is a contested and vexed one. And to productively engage in that conversation, I focus on an examination of the specific processes that produce understandings of Africa and Blackness in China. This is important because scholarly, political, and popular discourses in contemporary China attribute controversial and racialized events to ignorance. But what this ignorance thesis does is that it obscures decades of conscious state-led curation of knowledge of Africa and China, and hence an explicit engagement with media as sites of knowledge production is necessitated for my purposes. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is trace the social lives of the work of Zhu Mingying in thinking about this. And one note that I would just like to point out is that some of the images of racialized individuals that I would be showing may be disturbing, but they are important and crucial, central to the analysis that we'll be doing and talking about. So music played a supporting role in diplomatic exchanges. Music and dance performances were central in receptions of world leaders, often curated to include performances unique to the countries of the guests. Cultural exchanges contributed to promoting third world unity that was being fostered in the Mao era. And institutions such as the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble, Dongfangge Wutuan, and Yunnan National Defense Song and Dance Troupe, Yunnan Guofangge Wutuan, were tasked with bringing, quote, China to the world and the world to China. This was achieved by inviting foreign song and dance troupes, as well as visiting and performing in what was referred to as friendly nations. So in the 1950s and 60s, song and dance troupes from Ethiopia, Sudan, Bolivia, Cuba, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico, among others, visited and performed in China. In 1965, the Chinese Folk Art Division of the Yunnan National Defense Song and Dance Troupe went on an over 2-month performance tour to Mali, Guinea, Mauritania, and Ghana. They visited 23 cities and staged 49 performances, and with a total audience of about 75,000. These touring groups brought back material traces of cultural objects, and some of these were cassettes of folk songs. They also learned songs in countries they visited and occasionally performed them in China upon their return. So it was these cassettes that exposed Zhu Mingying to folk songs from around the world. And Zhu Mingying finished dance school at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. And she was accordingly sent to the communes where she worked. And she only got to start her career as a dancer at the revamped Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble a decade later. Zhu Mingying studied folk songs brought back by traveling troops as a hobby, and she caught her break during the visit of Congolese president to China, Mobutu Sese Seko, where she was the only one in her dance troupe who could sing in Lingala, a language spoken in Angola and the Congo. And at the welcome ceremony. And although she was a dancer, she later became well known for singing folk, Chinese ethnic minority, Africa, South Asian songs, among others. Zhu launched her career through stage performances for a Chinese audience, singing over 100 songs in 26 languages. She also produced and sold 5 million copies of a record in 1 year, winning a Golden Record Award. But at the height of her fame, Zhu Mingying decided to pursue a self-funded degree program at Berklee College of Music in Boston. And upon retiring from active performance, Zhu Mingying established Beijing Mingying Development Corporation, a company that imports, subtitles, and promotes foreign movies and music to television stations in China. So before continuing talking about Zhu and all that she's doing, I would like us to get a sense of what her stage performances looked like in the mid-1980s. Ooh. Okay, great. Great. And so, again, I would like to recognize my fantastic colleague from the Congo, Guillaume Kalunji, who translated and subtitled this. And this song is in Lingala, but also mixed with a few other dialects as well as French. And so, yeah, he translated what he could from from the languages and dialects that he understands, right? From this. And so Zhu Mingying reflected on her career in numerous interviews at the time and later on in her life. And when she was asked about the nature of her art, Zhu's response was, and I quote, "Even though my songs were imitated, I felt like they were mine. When I got on the stage, the desire to create them was so strong that I put myself in the role. When I sing African songs, I think I am African. When I sing Indian songs, I feel like an Indian from within." So the motivation for this appropriation and embodiment, according to Zhu, was in response to Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai's directive to the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble to, quote, "learn other people's art well, offer true representation as a way of showing respect to people and cultures of other third world countries." So situating her routine within official state discourse, Zhu brands her act, her dressing in Western Central African clothing, her use of blackface as a search for authenticity. This, however, raises questions about whom this perceived authenticity was targeted. Zhu's performances of other cultures began at welcome ceremonies for visiting dignitaries and diplomats from Congo. She, however, did not dress in Congolese-style clothing, nor did she paint herself black in these performances. Not only did Zhu do all this on a stage performance for a domestic audience, but also extensively used this imagery in marketing of her records. So these are samples of records that I obtained from antique stores in China while I was working on this. And so we have a huge room, but I'm just gonna pass this around to give you a sense of what these looked like. I taped them because the tape itself is a bit fragile. You can see that information on the front cover and on the back cover of that. And so these were produced in the mid 80s, but as time went on, especially around the 1990s, when media technologies emerged and were more accessible, Zhu also produced CD records, right? And so these are some records of some of the work that she did. And by the 90s, she had already retired. And so a lot of these CDs particularly were more of celebrations of the work that she had done over the past decade and collections of some of the work that she had done over the past decade. And Zhu Mingying produced these records. They were mainly of her musical performances. And these were mainly of folk songs that she had performed on stage for films and at diplomatic receptions. So in 1984, Zhu Mingying released 2 albums, the first 2 cassettes that are going around, right? So one was produced and marketed by China Record Company based in Beijing, and the other by Pacific Audio and Video Company based in Guangzhou. And so what this did was that it ensured that her cassettes were marketed from north to south of the country. And Solos of Zhu Mingying, which is this one, Solos of Zhu Mingying, produced and marketed by China Record Company, consists of 16 songs, right? In multiple languages, including Mandarin, Cantonese, Lingala, Arabic, Lebanese Arabic, Bengali, and Urdu. The insert provides lyrics to Chinese songs, while brief descriptions, either of background or the meaning of the songs of non-Chinese songs are provided. The front cover of the cassette case features a picture of Zhu Mingying painted from face to palms in light black paint, dressed in 2-piece dress common in West and Central Africa with a matching headgear, posed in a dance step. This image was a familiar one that she had put on in stage performances, like the one that we saw a few moments ago. At the top right corner of that cassette, we see Zhu Mingying without her costume or makeup. According to Zhu, after performing on stage or doing her Central African folk song routine for a long time, many people did not know the face behind the act. And this was because in these performances that we saw, that her routine involved songs from different cultures and multiple countries. But Zhu Mingying, even though in certain performances she got the chance to change her costume, she did not get the chance to take off her makeup before coming back on stage. So what this resulted in is that we see Zhu Mingying performing songs in different cultures, in the same Black makeup. And although she appeared on stage dressed in traditional clothing of different countries and cultures, her choice of cover image for this particular cassette is a sole depiction of her as Black and African. This is of significance because out of the 16 songs on that record, only 2 are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ju's record was produced fewer than 10 years after the decade-long Cultural Revolution had ended, and politically in the 1980s marked the beginning of a relatively liberal period for the production and circulation of cultural goods from both within and outside China. Socially, there was a longing for and heightened curiosity in non-Chinese cultural commodities. Ju's attraction to and interest in African folk music, as well as her subsequent performances, exemplify the yearning of her audience, not only for something different, but also for greater exposure to what had been going on in the wider world following the decade-long isolation. Her multiple language record from multiple countries could also be understood as an attempt to cater to this curiosity, hence its popularity, which resulted in her subsequent fame. Ju's acts and records extensively appropriate Africanness for commercial purposes. She presents a mediated African woman, not only in her dress and makeup, but also in her dance, posture, and demeanor intended for her audiences. But this does not, however, reflect Ju Mingying's interaction with the African continent. Throughout her career, she had visited and performed in Egypt, Tunisia, and Algeria multiple times. However, she did not visit any country in West and Central Africa. Ju's decision to stick to what she was famous for, that is, being Black and African, to market her records, reinforces a defamiliarization of Blackness. Black images and West and Central African clothing were selected as they appealed to the taste of an audience looking for an exotic cultural experience. In several interviews later on in her life, Ju revealed that her Black makeup was a requirement made by her stage director and producer, and that she was paid 0.3 yuan as compensation for wearing Black makeup. This amount was, however, equivalent to her performance fee per show, which speaks to the importance of her makeup to her directors and producers. It is worth noting that cultural workers were salaried employees of the state, and so these performance fees were an extra allowance for performing on stage. Right? I suggest that the choices of Ju were linked to the perceived influence of an audience on artistic productions. The Black makeup was tailor-made for a Chinese audience and points to the prevailing image of the African in the Chinese imagination. Ju's use of blackface desensitizes the Chinese audience to the problematic history associated with it by making them more acceptable in the media sphere of Chinese society, one that some scholars have framed as undergoing the process of racial learning. And Lan Shanshan defines racial learning as developing and accumulating knowledge about differences and hierarchies of race through lived daily experiences in various settings. But beyond experience, I suggest that this form of learning is preceded and mediated through popular media, such as music. In 2021 annual Chinese New Year's Gala's performance, a 70-year-old retired Ju Mingying took the stage again for a performance titled Feijiu Gewu, African Song and Dance. And I can talk more about this and the reactions that emerged during her return on the stage in 2021. But as China becomes more assertive in global geopolitics, unlike in the mid-1980s, it is increasingly difficult to produce content solely for a domestic audience. For instance, the 2021 CCTV annual Chinese New Year Gala, Chunwan, was broadcast live on 600 media platforms in over 100 countries, making it necessary to think critically about its non-Chinese audience, some of whom they portray and how they are affected by these performances. The growing number of international students, pre-COVID particularly, in China who are fluent in Mandarin speaks to a global China that includes the foreign in China. Therefore, a global China inadvertently have a global Chinese audience, be it a linguistic one or a geographic one. Zhu Mingying's record served as an avenue for discussion on different cultures. Music in general, and folk music from Africa in particular, was not only performed on stage and made into records, they were adapted into middle and high school music curricula through the introduction of what was known as world music lessons. Music is not one of the subjects that is tested for the competitive college entrance exam, Gaokao. And so it is allotted, little time and less resources, and it is designated as an interest class, a Xingquban. Still, it remains one of the few avenues in the classroom for students to gain an understanding and exposure to different global cultures. So this is an example, this is a sample lesson plan, and lesson plans in the absence of classroom visits and classroom observations offer an insight into what these lessons looked like. They offer a step-by-step approach to the lesson, the activities, and the assignment. So for instance, this lesson plan starts out by stating the objectives of the class, and followed by a systematic step-by-step approach to, well, this is what we'll do first in the class, and this is what we'll do next in the class. And if anybody has been a teacher in elementary school or high school, like that classic lesson notes or lesson plan is what these looked like. And so I'll discuss an analysis of 12 lesson plans on African music classes between 2002 and 2018 to understand how Africa is taught through music in China. And of these 12 lesson plans, 7 are for middle school and 5 are for high school classes. They focus not only on African songs, but also musical instruments and dance. 5 of the 12 lesson plans focused on African songs, and of those 5, 3 were dedicated to the Congolese song for which Zhu Mingying was famous. A 2-line synopsis of the song on Zhu's record serves as a basis for establishing the background and meaning of the song in the classroom. And it is either paraphrased or quoted directly on these lesson plans. In the classroom, Zhu's version of the song is listened to alongside the original, and reference is made to Zhu Mingying's popularity in the 1970s and 80s. As a way of offering a historical background and reiterating Zhu's influence in popularizing the song. So one recurring aim of the lesson plans examined is stated as to develop an open mind to understand and appreciate African music and to foster multicultural understanding, among other variations and iterations of aims that echo the above. Classes typically begin with establishing the context of the song to be studied. They draw on evolutionist, historical, geographic, and cultural knowledge as a way of contextualizing songs and stating their origins. So one common approach is to assign homework prior to the class, and this focuses on general knowledge of the continent's geography, history, and culture. This approach, however, presents a challenge both linguistically for those students who do not speak any other language other than Chinese, and in terms of accessibility to source material within the context of search engine restrictions in mainland China. And while offering an avenue for students to actively engage with other cultures, some lessons tend to reinforce existing stereotypes of the African continent, exoticizing and essentializing it as a place of primitivity, wildness, and simplicity, bolstered by referencing of wildlife documentaries such as Animal World. There is also an overgeneralization that is evident in a lot of the lesson plans examined. In one such lesson that stresses the diversity of musical forms, one Congolese song is taught, after which a teacher asks students to summarize the characteristics of African music. The importance of some cultural forms are sensationalized and exaggerated over others. So for example, the role of the drum in African communities is highlighted as omnipresent and can be heard everywhere. Although full of potential for active engagement, world music classrooms are ridden with challenges that range from expertise, resources, to the reproduction of popular discourses of the African continent. So from performing during diplomatic visits, Zhu Mingying's work can be seen in 3 stages. First, music as spectacle. which through staged performances satisfies the curiosity of an audience whose perceived expectations also shape how these performances are staged. This is followed by memorialization through the production of records that carry additional information about songs that can be kept and circulated to reach a relatively wider audience through time. And finally, engagement begins with the teaching of music in middle and high school classrooms. This creates an avenue for engaging with other aspects of the African continent, from geography through culture to politics. Although this engagement contributes to Afro-Asian, Afro-Chinese affinity specifically, it also contributes to essentialized and racialized understandings of the African continent. And so I'll stop here, and I look forward to the conversations that this might generate. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.